Hey, we're back talking about our backcountry touring setups. We've talked about skis and boots, and we just felt it was appropriate that we talk about bindings a little bit. We always get questions about bindings. What bindings are we using? What bindings should we put on our skis? And right off the bat, I will say this, all this information just represents kind of what has worked for us in the past, some of our favorites. We're just gonna give you a starting point, somewhere to launch from, and maybe try and categorize backcountry touring bindings in a way that makes a little bit of sense and can help you as you put together a package. So if you go to skimo.co, they categorize bindings as race, meaning like Skimo race, lean, and full featured. That's a pretty wide kind of gamut. I'm gonna narrow it down a little bit and just say our three categories we'll talk about are ultralight, light touring, and maybe light freeride. On the fringes, you have your Skimo race bindings that weigh nothing and function almost exclusively just for Skimo racing. And then on the other side, you have things like Salomon Shift, Salomon Guardians frame bindings that are full-on freeride or resort bindings that you can tour with. But we're gonna stay in the middle. These are bindings for dedicated ski tours. On our lightest setups, we always put what we consider an ultralight binding. So some examples of that would be my favorite. This is the binding I seem to always put on my lightest setup, and that's the Skitrab Gara Titan. This is just a very clean, stripped down binding, but you'll find most of the ultralight bindings, minimal materials, very lightweight. The heels usually use just a U-spring for retention, meaning that there's no kind of mechanical pins moving or rolling on anything mechanical, but it's just a U-spring that your heel pops into, and usually just one riser, meaning that you kind of have a flat mode, meaning your boot can just go flat, so if you have long approaches, and then maybe one riser mode that just allows you to climb. Now, I think that's plenty sufficient, especially if you are using this with a very light, well-articulating boot. You really don't need any more high risers for that type of boot because the ski is so light and your boot rotates, and articulates so well that one riser takes care of like 99% of all your climbing needs. A must for me is always a flat mode. Not everybody is like that, but for me and where we ski, there's just lots of long approaches. So I need a flat mode at least as a feature, but one riser is fine. And then for skiing, the flap comes up, lock in. The Skitrab has a really unique toe system in that there's no, pop open, pop shut, that you actually have to push it open, position the boot, close. Lots of people like that because, you can hold onto this ski and try and, if you're on a ledge or something, position your foot and let it on. Other people have lots of trouble with that. Maybe they're not as flexible. Maybe they just don't like that. Another, example that I found that I like a lot is the Dynafit Superlite 150, their brand new one. This one just looks really cool. Came out with a cool color too. You can tell it's just kind of very minimal. They machined out as much weight off this toe piece as they could. It's your classic tech binding. There's no boot guides or anything, but just your classic, I don't think you're supposed to do this without a boot, but it's okay. Locks, unlocks. The heel mode, and one thing that I think sets this binding apart a little bit in the ultralight category, and when I say ultralight, I mean between like 100 and 150 grams per binding, is that this actually has a high mode, like a high riser. So it will do flat, and then it will do a low, but then it also has a high. And then also, once you start skiing down, so you're locked in and then you go for that first transition, you can do it just like a Skimo race binding where you just have the flap that covers up the pins for the way up to get to the top, open, lock down. It's these little features that you figure out, oh, that's very handy. I was looking for that, or it's something that's just extra and you don't need to worry about. But this is, two examples. Another one Danny has used quite a bit is the Plum Race 170, kind of their minimal style ski touring binding. It uses the U-spring also, but that might be something, if that fits, if that checks the boxes for all your needs, that you just need something light and something that you know, maybe has a flat mode and one riser, these could be the type of bindings you're looking for. And you can find these, again, within that about 120 to 150, maybe 170 gram range. The next category I would say is light or lean touring bindings, which they're bindings that just have a couple of more features, a little bit more mass, you know, they're just built maybe a little bit more durable. And for most people, these are kind of your classic touring bindings that you find on just a lot of touring setups. And it's a good middle of the road that's gonna last a long time. It's gonna be very versatile. It'll get the job done, do it well. Here's an example, a binding that I've come across lately. It's the Hagan Pure 10. And this Hagan binding is basically Hagan's take or their branding of an ATK binding. And I would say, you know, in general, ATK has become one of our favorite binding manufacturers in the touring world. They just, their bindings are very well built, machined, you know, lots of metal. I like to see lots of metal on my touring bindings, just gives me a warm fuzzy, but lots of really cool features and functionality that punch above their weight, meaning that a lot of their bindings have features that you only get in bindings that weigh considerably more when you compare them to other manufacturers. So this Pure 10, it's got a nice simple toe piece, again, kind of your classic tech toe piece. It uses a design where they only use springs on one side. Now the heel pieces on these is where on this kind of next category you find a little bit more functionality or more features. You'll usually have at least two risers. Well, I'd just say, you know, you'll have a flat mode, just like the other bindings, but then you'll have a, you know, low riser mode. And, you know, if you flick it back, you can flip this the other way, you've got a high riser. So you might, you know, most of the kind of classic touring bindings, I would say, have a flat, a low, and a high riser mode. They all accomplish that in different ways with different kind of flaps and setups, or if you have to turn. This doesn't use just a simple U-spring, but it actually has a cam device in the heel piece to control the release of these pins and, you know, how they move in and out. What that does is that it makes it much more smooth, makes the entries much easier. It makes the release adjustable. Here you can actually adjust, you know, how hard of force it takes to release. You know, in alpine bindings, we call that a din setting. Tech bindings don't really have a standard din setting, but it just has the ability to make it tighter or looser. This is a smoother entry, smoother exit, more consistent release. And this binding happens to have actually a little bit of fore-aft flex, you know, built in. There's a spring, and you know, when you flex that ski, these pins are moving in and out of your boot. And at some point, if you flex that ski enough, your boot will contact that heel piece. And if you hit it with enough force and it can't move, you could break your heel piece off. Well, they've built in a little bit of spring flex into this so that, you know, your boot can touch that and it will move backwards to absorb a little bit of that impact if needed. So to me, that's just like, we've packed a ton of features in this very svelte binding. I believe it comes in at like 250 grams, somewhere in there, 250, 260, but that mid 200s. So, you know, a little bit heavier than your 120, 130 gram Skitrab, but you're getting something for those grams. You know, it's not just a heavier binding. Another good example would be, let's see, I skied the Marker Alpinist. I really like that. Some people had strong opinions about its risers, but I think, again, you just need to know how to use them appropriately. The Salomon and the Atomic Backland. I think Salomon calls it something else, but it's the exact same binding, just branded different for Salomon and Atomic. And we've used that on our skis, and that's a great example of a, you know, mid-weight, but, you know, strong and full-featured binding. And so something in that category probably will meet most of your needs. You know, the only reason to go lighter is if you're just really trying to put together the lightest setup you can. And the only reason to go heavier is if you're dropping some big airs, if you're stomping, if you're just putting a lot of forces on your skis and maybe have a beefier boot or a bigger ski that you need to be able to drive, and you don't want to worry about, you know, a puny little Skimo race binding ripping out, then you might look at some of the what I call light freeride bindings. And again, the best example I have of this is an ATK binding. This one happens to be branded by DPS. It's the DPS R14. ATK calls it their Freeraider 14. And Hagan even has one that's awesome, a version, and it's called the Core 12 Pro. The reason I like it, and the reason it's, you know, it's again taking up a notch, because it is slightly heavier, about 360, 380 grams per binding, is that it adds one, you look at this toe piece compared to, you know, this toe piece, you know, you notice the screws are bigger, they're wider apart. What that does is on a big wider ski, this gives you a bigger platform, more strength, you know, as these forces, you know, are being put through this binding onto the ski, it's just a better, stronger connection to that ski. So less likely to rip out, less likely to break. They've got a great toe piece here, just a little bit more, you know, metal. I like just having something that I look at and say, you know what, that looks tough. That looks like a lot of beautifully machined aluminum and steel, and that's going to be secure. Similar to many other ATK bindings, you have the camming system in the heel piece, makes that entry and exit. What makes the entries very smooth, the exits very predictable, reliable. It has the spring heel where it will have fore aft, you know, give. So if you land a big jump and flex this ski, you know, that's going to absorb and, you know, move, and it's not just going to snap off the heel piece. And then they've developed these cool free ride spacers that works, you know, it's not just the brake here, but there's actually these spacers that mount. And when you put a boot on this, even in, you know, in downhill mode, your boot actually has contact with the bottom of this binding, which is very similar to how an alpine binding works. And this is something that I feel, you know, that's not a gimmick. That is something that with this binding, you can tell that is just a solid connection. Because you think about on a regular tech binding, your heel is floating in the air, and it's, you know, it's just basically hanging on these two little pins. And when you know, put that ski on edge, that boot is basically just kind of twisting these pins, you know, twisting the toe piece, but also, I don't know how they do it. Again, it's a miracle of engineering, but I love having that contact there of my boot sole, that I can feel that I'm actually, you know, pressuring the ski, not just twisting on the binding, if that makes sense. All this, you know, with a 14 release value in a package that weighs 380 grams, that's, you know, that's pretty cool. You know, you used to have at least a 500 gram binding to get that kind of functionality, strength, reliability, and now you can have it in this. Another one of my favorites is the G3 Z12. It's about the same, 360 grams, and it has, you know, there's lots of G3 fans that will talk about, you know, how they love the toe piece, has great snow clearing, the heel piece very smooth, great entry. The G3 actually uses a no gap heel piece, so it will not only, you know, it will actually sit almost up flush with your boot and just kind of give you, again, that better connection, better feel on the snow. Do you need a binding like this? I'd say most entry-level tourers or people getting into the activity probably don't. I'd say you're probably better off saving the weight and oftentimes money, and maybe finding something a little leaner, but know that when it's time to get rowdy, there are options out there, and you do not have to immediately buy a marker kingpin or a Salomon shift. There are options that are, you know, much lighter, might work a little bit better. Danny, let's see. Here's a great example. On Danny's big powder ski, he has the Plum Yak, and this is kind of your light free ride binding. I mean, this thing will survive the zombie apocalypse. There's so much, you know, metal, and it's you know, all CNC machined. Plum is infamous for just their strength and their durability, and but at a weight that really belies its capability. So just another example, and you can see a difference between, you know, that binding and this binding. And it makes sense, you know, this is a big fat powder ski. Danny likes to jump off big things sometimes if there's a big soft landing, and that was I think it worked great for him. So I guess if there's a takeaway, it's just find the lightest binding that has the features that you need and go out and ski it a lot, and then you'll figure out if you need to look for something else next season. And there's so many options out there right now. Skimo Co. in Salt Lake has a whole wall full of bindings, and there's tons of options, so just get out there and go ski them.